So, hello and welcome. Let me take you to Brazil, to Copacabana, carnival, balletic football, and of course, the magical girl from... Do you know what? I've really had enough of that. How many countries are quite so imprisoned by stereotypes as Brazil? I'm really fed up with it. And this stereotype image we have of Brazil has prevented it from coming out onto the world stage, in my opinion. And I wanted to find out, why was that the case? Why is Brazil so imprisoned by those images? So I went to live here for several months in 2013 in Rocinha, or Rocinha. And Rocinha is, as David said, the biggest slum or favela in Rio, actually in Brazil, and some argue in the whole of Latin America. It has over 100,000 people in the space of a small village. And as I say, I lived there for several months, and I'm in my late 50s. I know, it's hard to believe, but it's true. And in my late 50s, believe me, these adventures of going to live in places like a favela, they're not so easy. It's really quite tough. When it rains, it comes down in biblical proportions at 2 o'clock in the morning, and you're sleeping there, and soon you're not just sleeping, you're swimming as well, because it comes through the roof and it comes into your room. It's too hot to get to sleep, or too many couples are engaged in fierce domestic arguments, and the dogs are always barking. And when the rain comes, the sewage comes up with it, because there are open sewers everywhere in Rocinha. It is a really hard life, and I felt that if I was going to write about this, then I had to experience it, and I even had to learn Portuguese, which was probably the most difficult task of all. Now, I was living in Rocinha in 2013 and 2014, after the process known as pacification. Pacification was when the state finally decided it had to do something about the squalor and the violence in favelas. And this is how they arrived with pacification. With their special forces operations, the Battalion of Special Police Forces, which is an organ of state, and as you can see, they announced their intention with their logo, a skull with 2 guns crossed behind it, and then a dagger through the crown. So you can see there's quite a lot of mistrust between the state and the favelas. And this is a really important thing. These communities have existed in some cases for 60 years, most of them for 30 or 40 years, and there has been an absence of state. The state isn't there. That's why the sewers are still open. That's why when it rains, the electric substations, which are illegal wires stepped down from the main network, why they blow up and the lights go out in the favela. That's why people die in the favela of tuberculosis, because there aren't the health facilities there. That is what the absence of state means. And so I got to know in prison this man, Antonio Francisco Bonfim Lopez, or Nem of Rocinha, who ran the favela as head of the drugs cartel, but effectively as prime minister as well, for 5 years. And he was arrested in November 2013. I wrote to him, and he invited me to go and visit him in jail. And in total, I saw him 10 times and spent about 30 hours with him, talking about how he ran the favela, about what his priorities were, what his commitments were. And very quickly I realized that this was a man running a huge corporation. He was uneducated, though, entirely uneducated, and he had got into the drugs trade very late in his life by the standards of the narcotics business. He was about 24 when he joined the drugs trade, by which time most drug bosses are either dead or retired. And he got into it because at that stage he had a job down in the town, but it didn't pay him very much money. He got into it because his 10-month-old daughter developed a very severe autoimmune disease called Langerhans cell histiocytosis. And the only way he could afford to treat his daughter was to borrow the equivalent of about £5,000 from the man who then ran the favela as head of the drugs trade. And the only way he could pay that back was to go and work for him. And that's why this really is a Breaking Bad story. But he had no intention initially of getting into the drugs trade. So I wanted to find out what it was that he was doing as Prime Minister and head of the cartel in terms of meeting the needs of the community. Now, I want to go back a little bit and talk about Brazil very briefly, because, as I said, it's locked in by the stereotypes. But why don't we know very much about Brazil? And what is Brazil's potential? Well, Brazil's potential is absolutely immense. It's an enormous country. That's the thing that you get when you first go there, just how big it is. It's incredibly diverse. But listen to this. It's the 7th largest economy in the world. It has a bigger economy than India, than Russia, than Canada, than Australia. It is the largest exporter of beef in the world, of orange juice, of coffee, of soya. It has immense mineral resources. Its known iron ore reserves alone will supply the entire globe for 500 years. It produces 90% of the world's gemstones. It has oil, it has gas, it has uranium, it has rare earth minerals. It is quite extraordinary, and yet we know nothing about this. And of course, it has the Amazon, which all of us really, really need to know about. But there's one more little statistic that I want to tell you. It has 2.7% of the world's population. It has 10% of the world's homicides, of the world's murders. It's a very violent country. Every year, 50,000 Brazilians die at the hands of other human beings. Why is that? Well, let me tell you that in 1982, the murder rate in Rio de Janeiro was exactly the same as the murder rate in New York City, 21.9 per 100,000 head of population per year. And then this came along. Yes, cocaine. So, the Colombian cartels were feeding the United States with cocaine, but they couldn't produce, the Americans couldn't consume anymore. The Americans are quite extraordinary. 5% of the global population, 40% of the world's cocaine consumption. Really, they were doing their level best to snort everything Colombians could throw at them, but they couldn't manage it. And so the Colombians said, look, we haven't got enough $1 billion yet, talking about Escobar and the Cali cartel and this sort of thing. So they said, we need to develop other markets. Let's go to Europe, because there's a lot of money in Europe, and I'm sure they're just like the Americans, they'll do coke as well. And of course, they did. But the trouble is, between Colombia and Peru and Bolivia and Europe, apart from the Atlantic Ocean, there's Brazil. And so Brazil became the main transit route for all cocaine going from the Andes to Europe. And whenever it happens that a country becomes a transit country in a narcotics industry, then it also develops a very healthy retail trade as well in its own country. And this, of course, happened par excellence in Rio de Janeiro, which is, after all, a party city. And the cocaine was distributed through the favelas. because, of course, with the prohibition of drugs, the value of the drug is inflated, and so the favelas could sell them for a lot of money. There's no other business. There's not much other business in the favelas. There's certainly nothing that can turn over those types of profits. And very soon, the people in the favela selling the cocaine discovered that they could purchase weaponry from it. And they could purchase really powerful weaponry with this money. So they would buy the weaponry, a lot of it from the United States. So you have this wonderful cycle of the Americans supply arms and the South Americans supply cocaine. It's a very, very effective trade indeed. And with those weapons coming in, the violence increased. Now, it was very peculiar in Rio de Janeiro, because in Rio de Janeiro, unlike the rest of Brazil, where the favelas and the slums are on the periphery of the city, in Rio, because of its peculiar geography and the legacy of Portuguese colonialism, the favelas were all built on the hills. And actually, favelas in Rio are not called favelas, they're called the hill. And the middle-class residential areas are called the asphalt or the tarmac. So, if we have a look again at Rocinha, what you see is in the middle, there is Rocinha, and it's 120,000 or whatever it is people there. And just down at the bottom, you see São Conrado, a middle-class area. And just over the hill, you can see Ipanema. Beyond that, Copacabana. There's also Leblon there. And a bit you can't see is Gavea, another very rich area. So for Rocinha, this meant it was in prime retail position. And it ended up selling 60%, distributing 60% of the cocaine that was consumed in Rio de Janeiro. And that was a great deal. Now, when I spoke to Ning Antonio about all of this, he was very forthcoming. He told me about how the business worked. He told me about how many people worked for him, what their responsibilities were. He told me about his relationship with corrupt policemen, with corrupt politicians. He told me about the violence. He told me about the sense of community there is in Rocinha, everything about how the drug trade works. And he also told me about the moral dilemmas that he faced every day dealing with this business. Now, I will just say in parentheses now that anyone from the outside who works in areas like Rocinha and who has researched issues like cocaine and the effect it has had on those people's lives and on the rate of homicide and so on, anyone will tell you, I think, in my experience certainly, that the war on drugs or drug prohibition, or call it what you like, which is driven out of Washington, keenly supported in capitals like London, is an obscenity. It is an obscenity. Here we worry about, and understandably, people becoming dependent on drugs and the occasional distress that it causes in this country. But when you talk about Brazil, when you talk about Colombia, when you talk about Mexico, we are talking about a policy, and I can talk about public policy because I don't have a dog in this fight. We are talking about a policy that leads to hundreds of thousands of people being killed every year. It is an obscenity, and we have to have drug law reform in the United States, in the United Kingdom, across Europe. Because otherwise, people like Antonio, who is naturally very, very intelligent, very entrepreneurial, and has an extremely developed sense of his moral responsibility, will end up as he was in November 2013, just before pacification. This was shown live on television. It was rather like the O.J. Simpson chase inside the United States, and there is Antonio being arrested. He is a man who actually has very serious ideas about how the favela should be run, about how you reduce violence, because under his rule he had a conscious policy of bringing the level of violence down, in part because that increased the trade in cocaine and made the place wealthier. But he is very concerned about levels of violence, even though habitually he was written off as public enemy number one and a psychopathic killer like Escobar, which he isn't. And just a quick plug for a couple of things. If you haven't seen Narcos, then please do see it, about Pablo Escobar. And you may have seen Narcos, but you may not have seen Elite Squad, which was made by the same director, a Brazilian film, and actually the same lead actor who plays Escobar. It is, in my opinion, required viewing, Elite Squad, to understand why countries like Brazil cannot get out of the trap that they are involved in. So, like in Mexico, where mariachi bands regularly now sing the praises of El Chapo and other narco leaders, we too have songs of praise for Antonio, which tell his story, but because, of course, it's Brazilian, it's a rap story. And I will finish off by showing you or playing you the rap for Antonio and translating for you as it goes along. Here we go. That means I saved my daughter. Life was cruel with me. I made a choice to save the one I loved the most. I made a deal, and I begged for God's sake that Jesus not punish me. I went against my commandments to save my daughter. My soul cries, and one day I will go away. As many judge me, but they don't know my story. I lived together with death. I lost my freedom. But when it was needed, I was not a coward. Society only knows how to criticize. It's easy to say for those who were not in my shoes. I did everything for love, and I don't regret it. Believe you me, Antonio, although he's understood as a gangster, was a very brave man because, and this is something that we heard just now from these incredibly brave men and courageous men working with the FARC and the Colombian government. Antonio tried to negotiate with the authorities, both to hand himself in, which is a very dangerous thing to do because other gangsters will not take kindly to it, but also to try and help the state bring peace and reduce violence in the favelas. This is all so distressing for the people of Brazil, but it is something that I wish people would begin to learn about and understand as much as possible, because Brazil is not just about Copacabana and the girl from Ipanema. Thank you very much.
Misha, come back. I want to ask you something. And Misha's written a piece that you can all read, a very strong piece in our magazine about how social media oversharing was one of the key factors in getting our man caught. I want to ask you briefly a couple of things. It can't be the safest thing for a British guy to spend time in the favela. How dangerous was it for you personally?
Well, it's interesting. After pacification, when the police went in force, in fact, in Rocinha, if you see it right down the middle of Rocinha, there's an entrance at the top, entrance at the bottom, and there's a main road going through it. The police controlled that area, but they couldn't control the capillaries to the side, this incredibly dense network of alleys and lanes. So I would walk down those because I was trying to get to know the place, and walk into a little clearing and be confronted with 12 young men aged between about sort of 16 and 21 with AK-47s, Uzis and so on, just sitting around. And of course, in that situation, it's like the situation where you meet a 220-pound gorilla. What do you call it? Answer, you call it anything it wants you to call it, because otherwise you're in big trouble. And so they usually understood that as long as I didn't take my camera out, I was a dumb gringo and that I should be left alone because I wasn't threatening anyone. And of course, that's exactly what I was, a dumb gringo.
You didn't give a very optimistic outlook for change. I mean, what do you think could make the change? Jose Miguel's approach to sending new messages in there, or does it need something more fundamental?
What really distresses me is that at the moment, although this appears a specific thing, it's not. Brazil is in the middle of a monumental constitutional and economic crisis, about which, again, we read very little. And what disturbs me is that budgets are being cut absolutely everywhere, including the budget for Rio's security. And that the pacification program, which actually contains the seeds of something very important, in my opinion, may well be threatened by this, just at the time that Rio is preparing to host the Olympic Games next summer. And I am not overly optimistic, it's perfectly true.
Uh-oh. Misha Glenny.